Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, and dear pupils, thank you for coming and good afternoon. And dear those watching us on the internet live, you heard it right. I mentioned pupils because we have a group of pupils that took a train earlier today from Kaunas with their teacher just to make it to this event today, because we have a very special guest today. My name is Linas Tarasonis. I am a Vice Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Business Administration, and it is my honor to welcome you in this magnificent aula parva of Vilnius University and to introduce you to the main speaker of today's lecture on global economy and US politics in 2020, Roger Charles Altman. Now, before I do that, I would like to say a few thank you words to, first of all, the Kazickas Family Foundation, Agne Vertelkaite, Vilnius Office Executive Officer, and the Kazickas family for this opportunity to host this event. I hope it will mark the start of many fruitful collaborations in the future. I would also like to thank the Vilnius University Endowment Fund and its director, Justinas Noreika, for co-organizing this event. And now I would like to introduce you to Arnoldas Pranckevičius, the head of European Commission representation in Lithuania, who has kindly agreed to moderate today's lecture. Before joining the Commission in October 2016, Mr. Pranckevičius spent 11 years working at European Parliament, serving as a diplomatic advisor to European Parliament presidents Martin Schulz and Jerzy Buzek. He is also a former policy advisor to the president of Lithuania, Valdas Adamkus. Most importantly, Mr. Pranckevičius is a trustee of Vilnius University Endowment Fund. So thus it is difficult to imagine a better person for moderating today's talk. And finally, I'm sure the introduction to Mr. Altman is not necessary, but I shall give it a try nevertheless. Roger Altman is the founder and senior chairman of Evercore, which is now the most active independent investment bank in the world. Mr. Altman began his investment banking career at Lehman Brothers and became a general partner of that firm in 1974. In 1977, he served President Carter as Assistant Secretary of the US Treasury for 4 years. He then returned to Lehman Brothers, later becoming co-head of overall investment banking. Beginning in January 1993, Mr. Altman returned to Washington to serve President Clinton as Deputy Secretary of the US Treasury for 2 years. In 1995, he formed Evercore. Today, the firm has more than 90 partners, 1,600 employees, and has handled over $3 trillion of merger, acquisitions, recapitalization, and restructuring transactions. He received his bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and a master in business administration from the University of Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Roger Altman. Thank you.
Mr. Altman, welcome back to Vilnius, and welcome indeed to this impressive audience, which has gathered in such big number and in such big interest to hear your speech and your insights on the current global affairs. And perhaps to warm up in this rather chilly January day, I would like to ask you, a general question. In 2020, we have just started a new decade. which of course is full of unknowns. And still in this world of unknowns, what would be your, verdict of the state of affairs in global politics and global economics today? How would you define it in few sentences?
Well, before I answer that, I want to say I'm here today in Vilnius, my fourth or fifth trip, because of my wife, Jūratė, who was born here in Vilnius and whose family has a home here in Vilnius, and who I'm very happy to accompany. But when I come to Vilnius, she is the important one, as she carefully reminds me. But in response to your question, I think this is going to be a very interesting and challenging decade. And I think two of the biggest elements of society in the world are under great pressure. One is capitalism, and one is democracy. Capitalism is under pressure because of the enormous levels of inequality that we're seeing throughout the world, especially the developed world. And a sense has developed that at least American-style capitalism or Anglo-Saxon capitalism is not working as well as it should because it has produced such inequality. And there's a tremendous debate about whether capitalism itself is still working. And in our country, we're going to see that as a central issue in the presidential campaign, an overall campaign that's just begun. And the second is democracy itself, because democracy is in retreat, at least right now, around the world. And authoritarianism is on the rise. And we see that from China to Russia to Turkey, to Hungary, Venezuela, so many other places. And many people forget that democracy, while an ancient idea, is not as deeply established as the idea of it. So America is often described as the world's longest running democracy, but America's democracy is only 244 years old, not very long. And it's really quite possible that democracy, as we think about it, at least from an American point of view or a British point of view, doesn't persist, doesn't continue. And a lot of people around the world are choosing authoritarianism provided that it delivers safety and order and a measure of economic growth. Because many of the authoritarian figures that I alluded to, whether it's Erdogan or whether it's Orban or whoever it may be, actually have been elected, at least in a nominal sense. Even Putin is in a nominal sense elected. But democracy, as we think about it, is under pressure. So these two central elements of global society, or at least Western society, are under pressure, and it will be interesting to see as this decade goes forward the degree to which they stabilize themselves or they don't.
Well, you talk about, crisis of capitalism, crisis of democracy, and whilst when one looks at the state of global development, say in the last 200 years, it's paradoxical that we have to talk about that today, because on the one hand you see incredible advancements in terms of science and technology, incredible advancement in terms of medicine, incredible advancement in terms of life expectancy that nearly doubled in 200 years. You've seen also, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of so many new democratic states, the enlargement of the European Union and NATO. So one would expect that today in 2020, we would be living in the world that was never as free, never as prosperous as before. What went wrong?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I agree with your premise.
I'm being provocative.
Yeah. I mean, for example, no nation or no people have shown greater advancement in the past 50 or 100 years than the Chinese. Just in terms of sheer, for example, reduction in poverty. But China has not been a democratic nation, at least in the past 50 years, since the Chinese Revolution of 1949. Another one of the most advanced states in the world is Singapore. Singapore, in the modern era, has not at all been a democratic nation. So it's not necessarily the case that social advancement is inextricably linked with democracy. It's not necessarily true. Now, I'm not predicting the demise of democracy. I'm just saying, or capitalism. I'm just saying it's under pressure in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I don't think they're about to disappear, so I don't think advancements in medicine and science and so forth are about to slow way down. And I would also add that the most powerful forces in the world today are not governmental forces. They're forces of society, technology, and I was just commenting in an earlier meeting that one of the greatest challenges the world faces, obviously, is climate. If we say to ourselves, only governments can solve climate, then I would be very pessimistic about any solutions or even any amelioration. But if we say to ourselves, maybe the private sector and the science community will come to the rescue, or may come to the rescue, I would be a little more optimistic. So I think the solution to something like that does not lie with governments. It lies with science, it lies with the private sector, it lies with philanthropy. And so even if democracy weakens, doesn't necessarily mean that advancement, social advancement, will weaken.
Well, in terms of crisis of representative democracy, we have seen not only the rise of new autocratic states that you've mentioned, and certain illiberal democracies, the way they like to call themselves, but we have also seen, especially here in Europe, but not only, in the Western world at large, the reemergence of radical ideas, ideologies of hatred, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia. These ideas, which were, especially here in Europe, buried under the rubble of World War II, are reappearing. And often, of course, some analysts are attributing the rise of those radical forces to two major events in the last two decades. The global financial crisis, 2008, and here in Europe, migration crisis in 2015. Now, 2008, which very much defined the last decade. The last decade, both in America and in Europe, was the decade of recovery, of getting out of this very, very painful collapse that we've seen. Yet some people say that, those crises happen in cycles, and every other decade or so, there's another one around the corner. As we enter this new decade, what is your inner feeling? Are we also risking another possible major economic decline approaching?
Well, you've asked a couple of questions there. Let me answer the first one first, and then we'll come to the one you just asked. Unfortunately, a lot of those hatreds that you refer to are ancient. They're not new. I mean, if you look at a history of the United States, for example, maybe the defining aspect of American history is slavery. And slavery began in the United States the same time the country began, really. The country was effectively formed in 1609, or at least settled in 1609, the way historians define it, and slavery was brought to America, I believe, in 1630. And whether it's anti-Semitism or whether it's racism or the other hatreds you mentioned, they're not new, and I don't think they're a product of 2008 or anything like that, unfortunately. Secondly, no, I don't think we're on the verge of another global economic crisis. I don't. Actually, I think the outlook is relatively good. Now, in a narrow response to your question, just narrowly speaking, financial crises occur regularly. And if you look at the history of the last 30 years, 40 years, there have been lots of them. You had the Russian debt crisis, you had the Latin American debt crisis, you had the Asian financial crisis, you had the, in our country, the savings and loan crisis. You've had about 10 of them that affected the world. So we will see another one, and it could even be fairly soon, I don't know. But in terms of a global economic crisis of the type of the Great Recession that we saw following 2008, no, I don't think so. I mean, will we ever have another one? Unfortunately, probably we will. But is it imminent or anytime soon? I don't think so.
And are we better prepared?
That's a hard one, because if you think about the crises I just mentioned, every one was different than the one before. And, you know, there's a saying in the military that the generals always fight the last war, meaning the way they plan for the next one is to just assume it'll be just like the last one. And each of these crises seems to come from an unexpected place. So the next one will probably come from an unexpected place, and therefore, are we better prepared for it? I think probably not. But I just don't see, I mean, almost all the crises I just cited, except for 2008, were able to be contained pretty promptly. So I would expect the next one would fall into that category. It'll be a crisis, and it may affect financial markets, but it probably won't affect society more broadly.
You've mentioned also in your introduction about the side effect of globalization, rising inequalities, and poverty, including in the Western societies. When you look at one of the key, perhaps, years of the last decade, 2016, which brought to the world both Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump in the United States, again, there are those analysts who attribute, at least partially, the causes of these upheavals to the rising inequalities within the Western societies, between the center and the periphery, between those who feel they have benefited from the globalization, those who have access to the best of the education, those who have access to health insurance, those who really thrive on the opportunities that present in a world interconnected and with open borders, and those who feel left out, those who feel that indeed, this current world is in some ways a threat to them, in some ways full of uncertainty and fear, and who have obstacles of access to both education and health, etc. If this is the case, would then the social exclusion, regional disparities, income inequality is the real new threat to this representative democracy and to the democracy concept as such?
Well, this is a very complicated subject, and we could spend the rest of our time talking just about this one question. Yes, Brexit and Trump reflect, I would say, the rise of right-wing populism. And a pretty similar phenomena in that regard. And that's occurring more broadly, as I said at the outset, than just Britain and America. And yes, that rise of right-wing populism reflects a whole series of factors, especially rural-urban divides and certain cultural factors that derive from them, and anti-elitism. And this is a really serious tendency or trend, and it has a lot of momentum. And I believe it's occurring much more broadly, as I said, than Britain and America. It's occurring in Europe. It's even occurring in Lithuania, I'm told. So a very big, complicated, long-term development. And you know, the energy in the developed world is in cities. I say energy, by that I mean growth, social dynamism, upward mobility, other such factors, and less so outside of cities. And so that's produced a political divide between cities and less developed areas, rural areas, less developed areas. That's very profound. If you look at a map of the United States and you look at a map of counties, not states, you see that Donald Trump won about 90% of the counties in America. But Hillary Clinton won the popular vote because she won all the cities where the population is, by and large. But it's a very stark divide. If you look at a map of the United States by county, you see that, and you have the traditional Republican red and Democrat blue, you have, the map is almost entirely red, except that the population is on the other side of that divide. So, very complicated, deep-seated issue, and it's going to be very hard to change it.
Well, and you know, to add to that, in the UK it was very similar. All the big cities, most of them voted for remaining in the EU. London, Manchester, Glasgow, Birmingham, Edinburgh, you name it. And most of the Brexit vote was actually happening in the rural areas. I guess also confirms a similar correlation.
Now, a lot of that has to do with levels of change in society that people are reacting to in a classic sense of reacting negatively to. And you see that places like you just mentioned, the UK, people feel have changed a great deal. They don't like the change. They want somehow to return to an earlier period of what they see as a more stable period, and seeing the communities look the way they used to look in every respect. And so it's a sense of feeling that their communities have changed too fast and changed too much, and that being part of the European Union in this case was a cause of that, and so let's get rid of that. And the same thing in America with the immigration debate. We have too much immigration, our communities don't look the way they used to look. We don't like that. We want to get rid of immigration. So this is a hard issue.
I'd like still, to go deeper a bit in this question of inequality and often miscommunication in between our own society, between different groups of people, and add the digital debate here. The digital technologies and, of course, the rise of internet, we hoped at that time would enable people, empower them, make possibilities to inform yourself much better with this vast and absolutely, unreachable horizons of information that is out there. In some cases, it has created a contrary effect, of creating digital tribes, of people closing in their own social bubbles without talking with each other, believing in conspiracy theories, in stereotypes, deepening those stereotypes about each other. And here Professor Harari, who is one of the also quite provocative futurologists, is saying that with artificial intelligence especially, we might see even bigger social exclusion in the future, as he is warning that we might be creating as the so-called, as he says, the new class of unnecessary people. What does he mean about it? that, in the world where transformation is so high and so large, there will be big parts of the society that will not be able to reskill in time and to find their role in the new economy, in the new model of the economy, and therefore the divide between the people might even rise. Would you agree with this argument? And if yes, what should we do in order to avoid such big division?
Well, I have two reactions to that argument, and I'm sure one could have many more than that. First of all, the digital revolution is certainly here to stay, and it's only going to accelerate. There's no such thing as stopping it or containing it or preventing it. It's like preventing the weather. I mean, it's very much here to stay, and there's no changing that, and it's going to accelerate. No matter what governments want and what regulators want and so forth, because this is what human beings want. They want the opportunities and the information and the ease of various things that are represented by that technology. Now, is it adding to inequality? I think it is, because it favors, apropos of being here at Vilnius University, it favors the educated, and it favors the skilled, and who can take advantage of it and use it to their advantage in the workplace or otherwise in their professions or their lives. And it disadvantages the less educated and the less skilled. So that, in that sense, yes, it is contributing to inequality. But it's here to stay. And of course, it brings with it enormous advantages. For example, medicine. Wearables, this is getting off the subject, but wearables of various types are going to be important medical devices. They allow you to check your heart rate, pretty soon to take your blood pressure, pretty soon to have a remote blood test on your own wrist, and so on and so forth. There are going to be tremendous health benefits associated with that, let alone all the aspects of very advanced medicine that we're seeing in the breakthroughs and so forth. So the digital divide, or the digital world, has brought with it tremendous benefits, which in my view outweigh the disadvantages, but yes, it is contributing to inequality.
Indeed, and probably, it's good early enough, to be prepared for that in order to avoid the worst possible outcomes. Here I also like Professor Harari's statement that, while in the past the people were fighting against exploitation, in the future they might be fighting against irrelevance. How to still remain relevant as an individual in the world of technological disruption.
Well, technology allows people to be more relevant than a non-technology world does either. I mean, if you think about writers, if you think about other types of creators, whether it's laboratory work or whether it's creating various aspects of the performing arts, however you define it, they can increasingly do that wherever they are. They can be in Tibet, they can be in Uganda, and they can be just as creative as if they were sitting here in Vilnius or in London. So I actually think it empowers people in a way that wasn't true before the digital revolution. Sure, there is downside. Yes, there's isolation, and there's inequality, and I mean, most huge elements of social change bring with them advantages and disadvantages. But I actually think it's empowering, not the opposite.
Of course, this is the original intent. We're sitting in the university. Does the university play a key role here in terms of bridging that divide?
Yes, especially if universities increasingly are able to bring into themselves less advantaged people. I mean, some American universities are trying very hard to attract students from different backgrounds, lower income backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, immigrant communities, and so forth, trying to broaden themselves, broaden their student bodies. And other universities not doing that. But a university can be part of the adaptation if it's actually affecting society relatively broadly. If you have a university whose student body consists just of relatively affluent students, not really.
Now, going a bit more globally, and talking about US and Europe, also in 2020, we should unfortunately state that the relationship is not very easy. There have been major disagreements in terms of approach, for instance, to agreement with Iran, or to the Paris Climate Agreement, to different international engagements, trade deals, security, cooperation with the NATO, and the list goes on, including, in general, the approach towards multilateral system. Do we need the institutions? Do they play a role today, including United Nations or World Trade Organization, or have they outlived themselves? And here you see a lot of difference. Do you see us somehow able to bridge that divide between Europe and America? Is it a tectonic change, or is it only transitional?
Well, here you have, again, at least two different possible answers, and maybe I could give six, but I'll stick with two. You have two things going on here. One is changing attitudes in America as a whole towards international engagement, towards multilateral institutions and so forth. And the second development is the rise of Trump himself. And Trump has contributed to this, but he's at least as much a reflection of it than a cause of it. The disaffection with international engagement and multilateral institutions and so forth didn't begin with Trump. And America is often misunderstood. I'm sure Lithuania is misunderstood. But America historically has been a rather isolationist country. And yes, you think of America, you think of World War I, you think of World War II, and coming to the rescue and so forth. And you think of the rise of institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and so forth, the United Nations. But it's really been, there's a deep isolationist streak in America, which arises because it's such a big country. Because if you live in, you live in the central part of the country, you live in North Texas, you're interested in your community, you're interested in your neighbors, you're interested in local issues, schools, crime. You're not really interested in the United Nations, or you're not really interested in Brexit, you're not really interested in any of that. And you wonder why the country is being diverted into that. It's existed since the beginning of the country, our country. So this questioning our international engagement is not a new thing. It's actually a very old thing. And it waxes and it wanes, and now it's waxing, if I can use those words. Now, Trump himself, my older daughter refers to Trump as the orange monster. Look, he's a very effective politician. I mean, whatever you think of him, however you may not like him, at least for some people, he's very effective. He rode into power on the back of some of this. He's obviously talking about how America's partners in Europe aren't paying their way, and he talks about that all the time. Well, that plays into a deep sense in America that we've taken on too much and we're not being compensated for it and everything else. His popularity has a lot to do with things like that, anti-immigration, anti-international engagement, and so forth. And it's hard to fight that because a lot of Americans, even if they don't like Trump, agree with him on those things. Ironically, because of the Iran crisis right now, the one that's going on in the last 1 month, it's ironic, but Trump basically campaigned on putting an end to, quote, endless wars, unquote. No more endless wars. That's very popular. It's really popular. Part of that is fatigue from Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth, but it's a popular refrain anyway. We shouldn't want any wars. So, and sending troops overseas and everything else. So, it's a deep-seated sense in our country, which is not at all brand new. And people like to say it's all about Trump. It really isn't about Trump. He's capitalized on it, he's exploited it, but it's not created by Trump.
Somebody has coined the phrase unwilling superpower, that America has always been unwilling, to be this global policeman, but was always drawn in different conflicts, even, if you take World War I and World War II, and other conflicts where America had to take leadership, but, would have chosen not to. And as you say, many presidencies started with, maybe in a different language, but with America First type of approach, right, including George W. Bush presidency in 2000, 2001.
Well, if you read a little history, and you read about America's entry into World War II and the 2 years or 3 years that preceded it, how difficult it was to get American public opinion moved over to supporting any American involvement. And President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, had the world's most difficult time figuring out how to do any assistance for the Allies, for example, Britain, in light of that very anti-war America First mentality. It's really interesting to read about the last 2 or 3 years before the war as to how virulent the anti-engagement attitude was in America.
And given
if
that
Pearl Harbor had not happened, we never would have come into the war, probably.
Pearl Harbor, of course, a trigger. Given that, what would be your advice to Europeans? Should we, as European Union, as European nations, try to convince the current administration or the future administration to stay active in the global affairs, or, as Angela Merkel has said, start taking our own fate in our own hands?
I think it's a mix of both. Fundamentally, America and Europe are allies. And I don't think that's going to change. Right now, that alliance is under strain, and Trump is a, antagonist, so to speak. But I think most fundamentally, America and Europe are allies, and I don't see that really fundamentally changing. However, Trump's presidency illustrates that certain things that have been taken for granted in the past, like Article 5 of NATO, that if any NATO member is attacked, America and others, all the other members, will come to its rescue. I still think that applies, but some people might say it doesn't. Maybe we won't do that, even though the article requires it. So it suggests that Europe should not take some of those things for granted. But as to whether Europe should, quote, go its own way and assume America has left the scene, so to speak, I don't think one needs to go that far.
Of course, everyone will be watching this year, 2020, a very important event across the Atlantic. In November, the presidential elections. The campaign pretty much has already started, very much overshadowed by the ongoing impeachment procedures. What is your take? What should we expect from this election?
Are we serving dinner here? Very hard to answer that in a succinct way, but first of all, of course, the campaign's in full swing. Not just started, it's in full swing. And the first primary on the Democratic side is February 3rd, so it's just 3 weeks away. And 6 months from now, or less, we'll know the identity of the Democratic nominee. Could be a lot sooner, but might be 6 months. And then the shape of the ultimate November election will be determined. It's going to be I think it's going to be an epic election because we have a very polarized country, and the divides have never been deeper. Now, if you step way back and you look at the U.S. economy and how strong it is, we have a 3.5% unemployment rate, we have a stock market at an all-time record, we have incomes now in the last 2 or 3 years growing pretty nicely after long periods of stagnation. You say, well, Trump would be automatically reelected. And pollsters will tell you that in the modern history of polling, any president with an economy this strong has always been reelected. So he has a lot going for him. And it would be remarkable in light of those strengths economically if he didn't succeed in being reelected. At the same time, he's a very, to put it mildly, divisive figure. And a lot of Americans, I mean, his approval rating ranges from 41 to 44, 45%. It's never been, ever, at 50% or better, ever. And so you have the following contradiction. No president in the history of polling has ever been denied re-election with an economy this strong. No president in the history of polling whose approval ratings are this low has ever won re-election. Something has to give, right? That's why it's going to be rather epic. Now, it's probably going to be a very high turnout election because Trump's supporters are very passionate and they're going to come out in big numbers. And depending on who the Democratic nominee is, there's a pretty good chance that the Democratic side will turn out its vote in pretty big numbers. You're probably going to have a very high turnout election and an extraordinarily expensive election. I read today, this morning, in the Wall Street Journal that the estimated media spending in this election, this is all across the whole country and including, I think it includes state and local elections, is going to be $20 billion, and in 2016 it was $13 billion. These are huge numbers. It's going to be a fascinating election, just fascinating. My personal view is that it's going to be very hard to beat Trump because when he occasionally stops to describe why he should be reelected, instead of yelling about impeachment or yelling about this or yelling about that, or sending 300 tweets a day, his arguments are pretty strong. I saw him yesterday. He actually yesterday was giving a press availability, and he spoke about we have the strength of the economy, the 2 trade agreements he just passed in terms of the new NAFTA, which is called USMCA, and the agreement with China just struck. And he talked about a few other things, and it was very powerful. You know, you listen to that and you say, wow, he should be reelected. But then, you know, he's so polarizing. And the level of antipathy to Trump among those that don't like him is, wow, it's deep. So probably going to be quite close again. And who knows?
It's a very polarized election, most expensive in history, very much dependent on the mobilization of electorate. Yet there was one big actor or player in the last election that, nobody wants to pronounce the name of, or everyone knows who that is, Russia. If one reads...
Well, I can anticipate your question. Let me address that.
So this time, will it be able to influence elections?
Well, first of all, I don't think Russian interference in our election in 2016 made any difference. I don't. Because people forget that Trump in 2016 was seen as having very little chance of success, and he ran a very skeletal campaign, chaotic campaign, and honestly speaking, his campaign was so disorganized it couldn't have conspired with anyone. So the idea that they were in some executive suite with, all these talented people around a table figuring out how to work with Russia. No. I mean, if the Russians were trying to get a hold of someone in the campaign, they couldn't have, because nobody knew who they were, and they didn't have nobody knew their phone numbers. So I don't buy the idea that Russian interference made a big difference. Did Russia try to interfere? Yes. Is that awful? Yes. Should we have retaliated in some form, which we didn't? Yes. Did it make a difference? No. Is Russia going to try to interfere again? I'm sure they are. But Trump will be a little careful now because this could blow up in his face. I mean, if he were somehow caught actively conspiring with Russia, that could be the end of him. So I doubt that Russia will again have much effect. Even though I'm sure they'll try.
So we might expect much more cyber resilience, much more fight against disinformation, also for preventive reasons, right? Because it has become so toxic to be mentioned.
The other thing is, if Russia interferes, and it's clear that Russia interferes, and Trump is defeated, Trump's successor is going to take it out on Russia. So if I were Trump's successor, and Russia interfered again, it would be a bad day for Russia. The United States has the ability to do quite terrible things to Russia. I mean, how about publishing President Putin's financials? We can do that. We have that information. President Putin is a kleptocrat, right? He's stolen billions and billions and billions of dollars from the Russian people. We can put that out there if we want. And we can inflict terrible damage on Russia. So if Russia interferes and Trump loses, and his successor is inclined, Russia will be sorry they did that.
Now, moving to
The United States is a much more powerful country than Russia. Russia is a weak, small, economically irrelevant country, right? It only has two things: oil and nuclear weapons. That's it. And a kleptocratic autocrat as running it. So, if you got some president who was certainly who wasn't Trump and was inclined to do this, whoa, be a very, very bad day for Mr. Putin.
very reassuring message, especially for Lithuanian audience here, which which more than anyone else believes and understands the difference between American and Russian play and power, as well as attractiveness. Another big kid on the block, of course, is China. And you said once that China is beginning to act more like a world citizen. We need China to be more active on the world stage. For example, we should want China to be a bigger participant and bigger shareholder in the IMF, G8 and G20. Some say that in these days we are seeing the decline of the West and the rise of the rest, namely China. Should we start being worried about it, or do you still think that China is still behaving as a responsible global actor that has no other ulterior motives?
Well, I never said China had no ulterior motives.
My sentence.
And they certainly do. I think the greatest concerns about China are internally within China. China's taken a big step toward the reassertion of authoritarianism through Xi Jinping, who is probably the most authoritarian figure since Mao, and who obviously believes, because he says it openly, it's not a secret, that the entire country should revolve around the party, and that everyone in the country, including the press, must be subservient to the party, and who believes that the role of the state in the economy and in society should be bigger, not smaller, bigger than it has been. So this is a big change. And Deng Xiaoping began an era of moving toward market-based approaches to economics. His famous line that he doesn't care if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse. And that began an era of opening in China, opening internally and opening externally to the world. And Xi Jinping has moved the country back. And so I think the greatest concern is internally within China. China's turning to be a very repressive society. And you can see what's happening in Western China and Xinjiang and the treatment of the Muslim community there. I mean, it's the type of thing that is really disturbing. We're talking about incarceration camps, and really quite brutal treatment of several million people. Now, I don't believe, on the world stage, I don't believe China wants to take over the world. I think the Chinese see themselves as having so many internal challenges. After it's a country of 1.3 or 4 billion people, that they don't want also responsibility for the world. They don't want to be responsible for the world the way America was, as you said before. I think they care a lot about controlling the South China Sea and what they see as their swath of influence regionally. And I think they care a lot about commerce and economics, which is what this Belt and Road Initiative is all about. But do they want to be a global superpower in the sense of trying to rule the world? I don't think so. Not now.
There's a rise of worry, especially in Europe, about Chinese investments, occupation by other means, especially through investments into the transport infrastructure projects, new technology firms. There are worries about intellectual property, about technological advancements which that might be in one way or the other also taken advantage of. In this case, Lithuania is also very much on that route of Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative. What would be your advice? To be cautious, to be welcoming of Chinese investments, or to be selective?
Well, I think the answer to that varies with each country you might ask it about, but if it were me, you want certain types of Chinese investment because you want any type of legal investment. But if China wanted to build my one and only airport or my one and only deep water port, I wouldn't be too interested in that. Because you've seen examples of where they decide to turn it to their own advantage, regardless of what the underlying nation's advantage is. So I think there's a level of investment you want, and there's a certain level beyond that that you don't want. Now, Lithuania is not in the category, really, of a country that China could, could subvert. I just would be careful, but investment, generally speaking, is a positive thing.
And finally, let's move to another very big global player, Lithuania. You've said it's your fourth time of your visit to Lithuania. Your first time was 25 years ago. And perhaps for all of us, it would be very interesting to hear your impression, how this country has changed, what transformation it has experienced, and what would be your advice for Lithuania, how to survive in this global storm?
Well, I'm quite impressed with the degree to which Lithuania has advanced. It's really quite visible to me, even versus 5 or 6 years ago, here in Vilnius at least. I mean, there's a great deal of development, there's a great deal of new employment, there's a great deal of new entrance into the Lithuanian economy. And I think that's very impressive. And I also think certain geopolitical factors are going in Lithuania's advantage because parts of Western Europe are under a lot of pressure, whether it's France or whether it's the obvious problems around Britain. And Lithuania, comparatively speaking, and some other countries like Poland, Czech Republic, are relatively advantaged by that. And I think, to the degree, I think Lithuania is well positioned, for example, to compete in the services economy. If I wanted to establish a really big new car manufacturing plant to serve Europe, I might not put it in Lithuania for reasons of geography and transportation logistics, but in terms of services, I think Lithuania is really well positioned. And I was very impressed that Lithuania has now surpassed Estonia in terms of countries that are seen as most attractive to do business in terms of both cost and ease of doing business. And so I think Lithuania's future is good. Yes, of course, there are only 3 million people in Lithuania, not 30 or 130 million people. But you know, that has certain limiting elements. But I think the outlook for Lithuania is quite good.
Well, there's probably music to the ear to hear the comparison with Estonia, to all the audience here of indeed number 14 in doing business rating. Lithuania has never been as high as currently. So this is probably a good chance to open up to the audience. We have about half an hour still remaining of time to hear your questions, to hear your remarks for Mr. Altman. So please be active. And I think we have mics in both sides, right, of the room. And I already see a couple of hands there. Yeah. Yeah, first there, and then Nereus in the front.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the lecture. I just, yeah, I'm here. Sorry. I just wanted to come back to the very first kind of statement that you made about capitalism being under pressure. And as you can see, you know, in 70s, 80s, U.S., you know, since the start of 80s in U.S., the most important goal of a public company, right, was to serve its shareholders. And, you know, every decision was based on that, you know, the performance of the stock price. But now you can see, you know, the recent trend of the capital really flowing towards these sort of responsible investments. You know, the ESG is a huge trend, especially in Europe, and now it's getting more and more important in the US, and you can really see the BlackRock's Larry Fink's letter recently kind of emphasizing the importance of these responsible investments. And you can see that, you know, the capitalism is now not only including the striving towards not only the shareholders, but also including other stakeholders like society, environment. So what do you make of that, and what do you think is the next step for capitalists really in this progression?
Well, my short answer would be watch what they do, not what they say. I think it's unclear whether this is a new phase of capitalism in terms of ESG and so forth, or whether it's just rhetoric. Now, I hope it's the former, but there was a highly publicized statement that the Business Roundtable in the United States made about how corporations exist for the benefit of stakeholders, not just shareholders and communities and employees and so forth. Honestly, my own reaction to that was maybe, meaning I agree with the statement, but I'm not sure it's going to be implemented. Our system is much too centered, as you said, your question says, around shareholders. It is often referred to as the, quote, shareholder supremacy, unquote, model. Centered around shareholders and a few senior, very highly compensated executives. And it's unbalanced that way. By the way, it didn't used to be that way. That's a development really of the last 25 years or so. And it really needs to be changed, in my opinion, to be moderated. But whether we're seeing the beginning of that moderation or whether it's just talk, I'm not sure.
Many thanks. There was another question right there. Demante, yeah.
Hello, Dimanta Ramkuta from Law Faculty of Vilnius University. I have a question concerning rule of law situation in the United States. Well, when we speak about rule of law here in Europe, we usually associate countries such as Poland or Hungary that have violations, but nobody really speaks here as well that United States has its own issues as well. For instance, I know that President Trump changed lots of judges in United States. So do you see more violations of rule of law and how it's going to affect a global economy and the state itself?
Well, here's one I can give a clear answer to. Thank you for the question. I think President Trump is the worst thing to happen to the judicial system in America since I can't remember. And there are two reasons for that. First, he's taking a completely political approach to judicial appointments, even more so than ever has been taken in my own lifetime. So he's already appointed, I think, 30% of the members of the federal appellate court system, federal appeals courts. And he's appointed, all of his appointees are white, young, and very conservative. He's appointing young people because he wants them, these are lifetime appointments, and he wants them to serve for 50 years. And I think that's a very unfortunate development because there are very few women, there are no minorities, and so forth. And then his own administration has broken new ground in terms of ignoring the will of Congress and really at least legal precedent and what's widely seen as correct legal behavior. So the administration, of course, has defied the subpoenas that were issued to members of the administration, has defied all of them, or virtually all of them, in terms of congressional testimony. I served in government twice. When I was in government, both during the 70s and the 90s, if you received a subpoena, you had to go and testify or participate. I mean, it was not debatable. It was a subpoena, it had a legal effect. So, and Trump has basically said, let the courts decide whether those subpoenas are enforceable. Well, eventually there'll be court decisions on this, and the Supreme Court presumably will weigh in, but that'll be long after the election and long after the relevance of the subpoenas. So, I'm not one who, thinks that the only thing you can ever say about Trump is bad. But I think here, he's been really a very negative influence on the judicial system, very negative. And this stuff is happening almost every single day. I saw just 2 days ago that, if former Ambassador Bolton actually does testify, and he's offered to testify, Trump said he's going to invoke executive privilege so that Bolton won't be allowed to speak. And he's taking a very extreme approach to these things, and I think it's quite negative.
Thanks. Nerijus, and then, okay, well, ladies first, then, yeah. Sorry.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a really interesting talk today. I'm Giedrė Kvadravičienė from AmCham, board member. And my question, I guess, will be more practical. Based on your experience, both as businessman and politician, what would you see as unused opportunities, or maybe not used well enough opportunities, of Lithuanian companies and governments to intensify the economic cooperation between United States and Lithuania, and of course, as for all Lithuanians, foreign direct investment of American companies in Lithuania of great interest for us, not only for economic reasons, but also for social development. Thank you.
Well, I think Lithuania, as I said a minute ago, is increasingly well-positioned despite its small size. And I mentioned services, and so, for example, financial services. A lot of things like compliance systems and compliance personnel and anti-money laundering personnel, things like that, are being located in places like Lithuania, or Poland or the Czech Republic because of both cost and labor supply. And I think Lithuania can do just fine when it comes to competing for those types of investments in employers. And as to how to improve its chances, I think education of various types is the way to do that. In other words, educating American decision makers, and there's a lot of different levels to that, including face-to-face communications and so forth, and the role that the president of the country can play himself and so forth. But I think the opportunity is really pretty good. I think financial services is an obvious target area. I mean, because there's quite a bit of it here now. And I do think that education and advocacy is the way to improve the chances. Because if people understand the competitiveness of Lithuania, that'll be the biggest incentive or the biggest factor in pushing them towards investing here.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much again for your presentation here. And my name is Nerijus Udrienas. I worked for two presidents, Adamkus and Grybauskaitė, and worked also as advisor to Ukraine government on European affairs. So I have many questions, but at least a couple I would like to ask. It seems to me that our Western civilization is kind of retrenching back. Like all the civilizations which started to build walls, they collapse eventually. And for us, and for me at least, United States is building walls, European Union is building walls against the migrants. We kind of seem to be on a retreat. And there is not so much leadership which would kind of propose new models of kind of way of life going forward to attract and integrate those people who would like to be part of this Western civilization. So how do you think we would go forward, especially since we have such much debt on our balances in the government, in the private sector, overall in households? How would we kind of recreate our model of Western civilization, our Western values, which were so much important for Lithuania that the West accepted us back to our to the family of the West? How would we go forward?
Well, I may not understand your question thoroughly, but I think Lithuania is on a good track right now. I don't see any great barriers to Lithuania going forward. That certainly none that can't be overcome. And compared to 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I think Lithuania is much better positioned. The country's come a long way, to its credit, and seems to me to be moving really quite in the right direction. Now, I'm not an expert. I'm sure you could tell me a lot of things that are problematical. Every country has problems. Every country has obstacles. But I don't see any obstacles that are insuperable at all. I think the country is well positioned.
Thanks. There was also a question in the third row. Yeah. Just try to speak and maybe it will...
Do I think what?
Do you think that authoritarian
Oh.
it can make it actually to the United States?
Did everybody hear that question? Question really was, can America find itself moving into an authoritarian regime itself? I think the answer is it's possible, but it's not likely. It's possible because democracies are fragile. And as I said earlier, a series of the most dictatorial leaders around the world today have actually been elected. By the way, I'd remind everybody that Adolf Hitler was initially elected. And I recently read quite a good book called How Democracies Die by two Harvard professors, published in 2019. And it's quite interesting. It's not too long either. It goes through a series of case studies. Venezuela, case studies over the past 30 years. Venezuela, Chile, Hungary, and a series of others where authoritarianism took over and wasn't there before. And it's very instructive because often this happens without people really knowing it until it's too late. And often it happens where the public welcomes initially the authoritarian figure like Hugo Chavez, and then later wakes up and realizes they've given up all their liberty, but then it's too late. I mean, again, Hitler was initially welcomed by the elites in Germany because he was seen as somebody that could fix things, and they could also control him. So he was elected initially. That's a kind of common way this happens. So it's possible. I don't think it's likely because the disappearance of liberties in America would be resisted. So it's one thing for Donald Trump to resist subpoenas, but if we started eliminating things like tried to do away with freedom of the press, tried to do away with most aspects of due process of law under the 14th Amendment and so forth, I think Americans would resist that. Now, the people in the other countries that became subject to authoritarianism probably all thought they would resist it too. So that's why I say it's possible. It's possible. And I do worry a lot about a Trump second term because I think it'll be more extreme than his first term because he won't have to run again and won't have to worry much about public opinion. And I think we could see some pretty bad things in a second Trump term. So possible, yes. Likely, I hope I'm right, no.
Thank you very much. We have a question on the second row here. We have actually even two, so we can maybe take both of you together.
Hi. First of all, Linas Valiauskas, Grow Capital Fund Manager, and thank you very much, Mr. Altman, for a wonderful presentation. Given your experience and impressive expertise on well, Treasury, government, and Wall Street, we discussed about this no correlation between well, social development and political development and economic development of the country. And Lithuania has been recently accepted to OECD, a sort of a club of developed countries, yet it's categorized as a frontier market by MSCI along with Kazakhstan, Benin, and Burkina Faso and other countries. So my question would be, what would be your recipe? What could Lithuania do? What would you do or suggest to do so that Lithuania would become a developed market or would have a developed capital market, financial markets? Thank you.
Well, I don't see Lithuania having anything in common with the countries you mentioned. Was one of them you mentioned Burkina Faso? Yeah, well, you know, that's about the things that I have in common with Brad Pitt. No, I don't know who came up with that categorization. Well, I just don't agree with it. I don't agree with that at all. I think Lithuania's counterparts are much more countries I mentioned. Poland, the Czech Republic, to some degree Hungary, countries like that. Those are bigger countries. And size brings with it advantages. You know, if I was an employer who wanted to relocate a 5,000 to 10,000 person workforce, I might be concerned about doing it in Lithuania because the country's so small. and the labor supply might not be adequate. And that's where the Czech Republic or Poland might have an advantage. And that's true, that's just true, that's a factor. It's a limiting factor. But otherwise, no. I think Lithuania is increasingly competitive rather than decreasingly competitive, and very fortunate to be a member of the Eurozone, in my view. And to the same degree, as I said earlier, that countries in Western Europe, whether it's Britain or whether it's France or even Germany, are seen as less attractive than they used to be, and I think they are, unfortunately. Countries like Lithuania and the others I mentioned are more likely to benefit. So this is hard work. This is a little bit like rock climbing. You know, it's slowly upward and very careful. But I don't see any reason why the outlook isn't quite good. I mean, this morning, I went over to a part of Vilnius I hadn't been to for a while. All kinds of new employers there, all kinds of new buildings, new businesses. Really impressive. So, look, if you only have 3 million people, there's some limits. But within that, I think Lithuania is well positioned.
Thanks. Please, another question. And yeah, I see your hands.
Hello, my name is Nerius. I'm a private equity investor. And Mr. Altman, I have a question. There is one issue which is quite global and may supersede even, United States or global economy. It's a climate change. Do you buy into the story, and what effect, if you think it might be true, it may have, on the global politics and economy?
Well, thank you for asking that question. Anybody who doesn't think it's true really needs to think that again. I mean, the evidence is incontrovertible. You can debate the degree of human contribution versus, call it natural contribution, but is the planet warming? Yes, of course it's warming. And are the widely followed predictions as to the warming curve likely to be correct? Of course they're likely to be correct. I mean, half the scientists on the planet have contributed to them. So, if there's one group of people I must say I don't understand, it's climate deniers. I just don't understand that. There are plenty of arguments you can make as to how humanity will adapt just fine, or somehow this is a natural cycle that we see every few thousand years, things like that. But as to whether the climate is warming, of course it's warming. And I must say, I think dangerously so. I'm a pessimist on climate in the sense that I think the worst case forecast of the IPCC, for example, is going to be realized. And I believe that's 3 degrees centigrade by 2050. 3 degrees centigrade is about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And that means a lot of things that, to me, are not very good. And just the level of climate refugees around the world will be so big that it alone will be one of the greatest crises humanity's ever seen. So I think this is the one existential problem that society around the world faces, or the planet faces. And it's not being taken nearly seriously enough. As I said at the beginning, I don't think governments are going to be able to solve this. And I really don't blame governments because, since mankind came into being 60,000 years ago, it's the nature of mankind to seek material well-being, whether it's warmth or whether it's food to eat or whatever it is. And if you live in India and there's something like 300 million people who don't have either or both of indoor plumbing and a fridge, if you were the leader of India or I was the leader of India, our obligation is to allow them, to the best of our ability, to have those things. And if our only source of power is coal, which in India dominates power, we would use that energy source to try to provide those people with those basic needs. That would be our obligation. So I don't think it's a fault too much of governments, because people want improved material well-being, and something like 80 to 90% of the world's energy today is being supplied by fossil fuels. But I do think, so therefore I think the solution lies in a combination of science, philanthropy, and the private sector. And whether that solution exists to a degree that really mitigates the level of warming that otherwise would occur, I don't know, but that's where I think the solution does lie.
Thank you for that. We have a very big debate on climate here in Europe as we speak, so very important things that you've said. We have only 3 minutes remaining. So I give you each 30 seconds for very quick, short answers, questions, and then in a row, and then Mr. Altman will answer them all together. So Dimante first, then you, and then there was a third. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Angelica, the Junior Achievement Organization leader or CEO here in Lithuania. As we are talking about the upcoming 10 years, 20 years, we have almost 50% of the population youth in globally. What do you see the role of youth in upcoming century, and maybe some leadership areas where young people should take a lead and move on?
Thank you very much. Second question.
Tomas Pilkis. I'm a student and working in the law firm. At the same time, you referred a lot to the past. I want to ask the question, theoretical question about the Western civilization. What are the pillars of the Western civilization in your opinion?
And the third one in the back.
Hi, Alice Kubelis from Vilnius University Fund. You mentioned shortly about bull market, which continues for 10 years, and what your insights or recommendations for investors at the moment?
My goodness, 3 very easy questions.
I think I have 30 seconds to answer them. First of all, I did not predict a bull market for the next 10 years. I have no idea. No idea whatsoever. It could be over on Monday. Secondly, youth. The problem the world has with youth is that there isn't enough youth. So if you look at the demography of the advanced countries, Europe, China, America, the demography is not favorable. Birth rates are falling really quite sharply. Average age of the society is high. And these countries are eventually going to face real labor shortages and other problems associated with falling population, the way Japan does today. And so I honestly think the problem the world has with youth is there's not enough youth. And finally, the pillars of Western civilization. Well, that's a tough one to answer briefly. But let me just say, I don't have any fears about the survival of Western civilization if we're defining it each the same way. I don't. So I don't know if I answered them correctly or
wonderfully
well, but it's my answers.
Here we go. And maybe one last question. You've mentioned one book, How Democracies Die, which I'm sure those who have not read will read because it's really a very good one. And as we are here in the audience of very curious minds and a lot of young minds that are studying at this and other universities, what are your other recommendations in terms of the must-read in order to understand this complex world and in order to equip ourselves to solve those major issues from climate to digital to social? Easy question.
Well, we could have a long discussion about the methods of reading. And by that I mean whether one wants to read nothing but material concerning one's area of study or area of work, or whether one wants a more diversified approach to reading. Now, I personally don't want to read only about things that pertain to my profession or to government or anything like that. I'd rather take a broader approach. So I'm going to end this talk today by thanking you for having me, thanking you for all turning out today, thanking my wife for bringing me here to Vilnius, and recommending science fiction. So 2 of the best books I read in the past few years were science fiction. And I must say that I hadn't thought of science fiction in many years, hadn't read any science fiction in many years, until I noticed a few years ago the following. So many of you may know, some of you may know, that our former President Obama each year publishes a list of his favorite books of the year, his favorite music of the year, and his favorite films of the year. And if you've never read them, they're really quite brilliant. And so I began to follow his books. And Obama likes science fiction, although he likes a lot of things. And he read a book which he recommended about 6 years ago called The Three-Body Problem by the Chinese science fiction writer Cixin Liu. And I read the book, and then I read the other two books he had read in this. It's really a trilogy. They took a long time, but maybe the most creative thing I ever read. Now, this is not for everybody because these books are intricate, but just unbelievably good. And just more recently, again, another one of Obama's favorite authors, Ted Chiang, who's written 2 collections of short stories, and I just read his first collection, not the most recent one, in which, among other things, he wrote the story that gave rise to the film Arrival. And it's an absolutely brilliant story, which gave rise to a quite beautiful film. So, science fiction.
Great. Well, let's hope that the future scenario of the world will be written not by Alfred Hitchcock, but by Jules Verne, one of the most famous science fiction authors of this world. And I'm sure you gave this audience a lot of great ideas, great insights, and a great sense of optimism, to be curious, to dream, and to hope for the better world. Thank you so much, Mr. Altman, and thank you all for coming.